I'd like to welcome our wonderful panel tonight. We've got Elise, Tuuri, Sophie Doubleday and Anita, Nedosyko. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional owners and custodians of the land which we meet today, the Adelaide Plains. We recognise the sustainable practices and knowledges of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that have protected our oceans and waterways for thousands of years. We would like to extend this acknowledgement of country to the lands for which our audience today is joining us. Tonight's event is hosted by the Royal Institution of Australia, or RIAus, who are helping us to connect people to the world of science. This event is being held at the RIAus building in Adelaide and broadcast across the nation. So to kickstart tonight's event, we're first going to introduce ourselves and how we came to be where we are, sitting here tonight in front of you. So I'm going to kick off with the introductions. So I grew up initially in the mountains of Tasmania, not too dissimilar to this famous countryside, Cradle Mountain country here. So I grew up surrounded by plants and animals, and I very much wanted to know how these all work, the ecology, the interactions. I also was very much interested in writing and creativity, so I was sort of toying up those two careers, but I decided to pursue a career in science. So I went and did my studies at the University of Tasmania, and the more I studied, I did a lot of terrestrial work, and then I thought, but we knew so much less about the marine environment, so I thought, that's maybe because we can't see it or it's harder to work in, so I thought that's where I could contribute, so I decided to pursue my interests in marine biology. So this picture here is when I was first studying my PhD as a student, and I worked on octopus. So I worked on boats in the rather chilly waters of southern Tasmania. And since then I've done lots of different things in science, but interestingly, 10 years on, I've working on octopus here in Adelaide, researching this amazing group of animals in the beautiful Venus Bay on the Eyre Peninsula. So I moved to South Australia about 8 years ago. I accepted a position at the University of Adelaide, and I studied things like climate change impacts and working on the chemistry of the bones of marine animals, because we can learn a lot about the past environment and how that environmental change is affecting those animals. So when I moved across to University of South Australia about 18 months ago, I did it to set up a research group, which is called MARIS. And a lot of what we do is looking at the chemistry of these bones. So I'm holding here an ear bone of a Murray cod. It's a chunk of a mineral called calcium carbonate. And as scientists, we love it because the chemicals get locked in this calcium carbonate in a very predictable way. And it's also locked in there. So if we look at chemistry in a muscle tissue, for instance, it gets reworked by the animal. So these bones are found in all sorts of different animals. So here I'm holding, if you squint and look carefully on my thumb, that is an ear bone of an octopus, and that is still calcium carbonate. And I'm using these structures at the moment for a new project with the Australian Research Council as a future fellow. I'm looking at how we can use the chemical fingerprints in these tissues to track the provenance of seafood. So that's tracking where the seafood comes from. So that can help us combat seafood fraud and illegal fishing activities, which can undermine our fisheries sustainability. People around the world rely on seafood for protein, and global demand is booming, but 90% of our fisheries are overfished or in the world or have reached maximum capacity. So the more we can do to help develop more sustainable industries is a good thing for our marine environment. So earlier on I mentioned that I was interested in writing and some of the more creative aspects, and it shows in science it's such a varied career and you can take on what you choose. So a lot of my work is also researching science communication and writing and how scientists can talk about what we do in better ways. So this is just a recent media coverage of a recent paper I did on acronyms and how we're all drowning in acronyms and alphabet soup and how we can use them less to communicate our message. So I'm just going to leave with this. This is like my treasures from a micro beachcombing session that I call it at Semaphore, some beautiful biominerals. before I hand over to Anita. So Anita is the South Australian Oceans Coordinator with the Nature Conservancy, and she has a particular focus on the restoration of threatened marine ecosystems, in particular shellfish reefs. Thanks, Anita.
Thanks, Zoe. My name's Anita. I'm a marine biologist. I love to surf and I love to scuba dive as well. This picture that you can see is one of my favourite places that I enjoy surfing at. It's on the Yorke Peninsula at Berry Bay. As Zoe mentioned, I work for an environmental organisation called the Nature Conservancy, and my job is to manage marine and coastal restoration projects. I really love project managing because I can just lounge back and let other people do a lot of the work. But seriously, I really enjoy conservation management because I get to use my knowledge and skills to influence decisions. And one of the key drivers for me is protecting and conserving our marine environment. One of the other things that I absolutely love to do is to draw. And I actually, before I studied marine biology, I studied art at university. And I didn't finish that. I'm still doing art, but then I transitioned into marine biology. And a really big influencer for me in being interested in the ocean was my upbringing. So this is a photo of my family, and I'm the rugged one at the front in the white shirt. My dad is a really keen recreational fisher, and so every single school holidays we'd go over to the Yorke Peninsula. And if you've spent a lot of time there, there's some really beautiful rocky reefs. And as children, we just spent all of our days exploring those rock pools. And I can remember one of the most interesting things was finding a dead dolphin on the beach as a kid and just being incredibly fascinated and wanted to learn more about biology. When I was at university, I mainly studied coral reef species and in particular clownfish. I was really fascinated by the symbiotic relationship with clownfish and anemones and was driven by that question of how does a clownfish live in a toxic environment like an anemone. And so in that picture before, that was me 10 years ago in my honours research up at a place at Lizard Island on the Great Barrier Reef, and then was lucky to go back 10 years later thanks to National Science Week, and look again at the population of clownfish and anemones and see how they had survived post a really big bleaching event up there. But now I am focused on cold water reefs. These reefs are probably lesser valued and known than coral reefs, but they, for me, are characterised by rocky platforms, lush kelp meadows, and really colourful sponge corals, shellfish, oysters, and just like the coral reef, these reefs are also under threat and under peril. For example, our southern shellfish reefs are 99% have been lost off our coastlines. And so a big part of the work that I'm doing at the moment is bringing back those ecosystems so that we can continue to keep those habitats for fish and also protect our shorelines and keep our waters clean.
Great, thanks Anita. So now we're going to introduce Sophie. So Sophie is undertaking a PhD at the University of Adelaide in both marine biology and chemistry. Her research is focused on the ways in which microplastic pollution can act as a vector to transport chemical pollution. Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks, Zoe. So as Zoe said, my name's Sophie and I'm from the University of Adelaide doing my PhD at the moment. I'm quite new to the PhD world. I'm only about 6 months in, so I'm just getting started on my research journey. But I think my love of marine science has come in a quite similar way to Anita, in that I grew up around the marine environment. I grew up in a little coastal town called Port Broughton on the Spencer Gulf. So I spent a lot of time in the water, lots of family holidays to visit family on the south coast of Western Australia, which is a beautiful spot. And all of that time kind of around the ocean, I just really grew a keen interest into what was happening under the water. And the older I got, the more I kind of understood that we didn't understand what was happening in the ocean. And I think that was the driver behind me getting into a marine biology degree. So I studied my degree at university, went on to do an honours year, which is like a year-long research project, and now I'm doing my PhD. And as you mentioned, Zoe, I'm looking at the ways in which microplastics can work as vectors for the transportation of chemical pollution. Now, that probably sounds quite complex, and the thing is that the more we are researching microplastics, the more we're understanding that it is a really complex problem and it's affecting so many different things that we didn't first think. So when plastics enter the water column, they will begin to break down into the micro size, and when they are breaking down, they can release all sorts of chemicals that were added to the plastics in the production process. So these chemicals are known as hydrophobic chemicals. So basically what hydrophobic means is they are water hating, kind of like oil in water. They don't want to mix. So what then happens is these chemicals can then grab back onto the surface of the plastics, and then the plastics can transport them around the ocean. Now, it's not just the chemicals that are coming from plastics that can do this. Things like pesticides, heavy metals, pharmaceuticals, and a range of other different chemical pollutants can act in this way. And that's what my research is about, is figuring out what kind of chemicals can act in this way and be transported around the ocean, and what happens to them once they're on the surface of plastics, because there's a lot of research that indicates that marine organisms are ingesting plastic pollution, and we're now finding out that they're not just taking up the plastics, they could be taking up these chemical pollutants as well, which is quite a big issue. So I will be looking at ways to identify these chemical pollutants in the flesh of marine species, and also the ways in which the chemicals kind of interact with the plastic surface. So throughout my PhD, I'm also really interested in STEM education, so getting out to schools and doing different kinds of workshops and talks to kids to try and make them understand the kind of careers that they can get to from studying a STEM degree. Because I know when I was trying to decide what I wanted to do when I finished school, I was really interested in sciences, but I didn't necessarily know where studying science would lead to. So I work with an organisation called the STEM Academy at the University of Adelaide, and we go out to different schools aimed at schools from years 8 to 12, and do lots of different activities that kind of get them to have just a little snippet of what a career in STEM could look like. So that's me.
Great, thanks Sophie. So now we'll introduce Elise. So Elise is also undertaking a PhD. She's undertaken at Flinders University, and she's in both marine biology and biological oceanography. Her research focus is on the abundance of microplastics also in the oceans and the role they play in the base of the marine food web. Thanks, Elise.
Thank you for that introduction, Zoe. So, as Zoe said, I am doing my PhD in marine biology and biological oceanography. I became interested in marine biology and the ocean at a very young age. One of my first memories of the ocean is on a flight from Finland to Australia, and seeing just how expansive the ocean is and how much of the world it actually covers. And as a little child, it was crazy to me to think that there's all of these animals and all of this life that lives underneath the surface of the ocean. I was very fortunate because I got to grow up in Victor Harbour on the Fleurieu Peninsula. So a lot of my free time was spent in the ocean or beach combing, and that really just ignited my passion, because you come across all of these weird and wonderful things on the beach, and it was really hard to track down what a lot of the stuff was. And even now, with my knowledge, I find people come up to me and ask me, oh, what's this thing? And they have the same sort of curiosity, but not the same knowledge that I have to actually point them in the right direction or tell them what it is, which has been really handy for me. My love for the ocean was so strong that I even work in the ocean as my part-time job when I was supporting myself through university. I was very lucky to get to work and spend my summers down at the beach as a surf coach. And that really just pushed it more because people in my lessons would ask me questions, not about surfing, but the things that they would find on the beach while I was running the lessons. I was really fortunate as well. Whenever I travel, I try to travel to new destinations where I can explore new reefs or new things that I can't see in South Australia. As much as I love the South Australian Ocean, I do have a curiosity for what else there is because every coast is completely different, as you can see. Here I've got a video playing from a reef in Queensland and then a completely different ecosystem up in Exmouth where I was able to swim with whale sharks. So my curiosity just kept growing and growing, and I got to this point where I was struggling to decide what I wanted to do leaving high school because I loved the marine environment, but I was really academic as well, so I enjoyed maths and science. But I also really loved education because I worked in schools a little bit too. So I decided marine biology would be a perfect combination of everything, and that's why I decided to pursue that as my career. My curiosity only grew more as I studied because the more I studied, the more I realised there's so much that we just don't know. And the more you learn, it just opens up a Pandora's box of questions for every new bit of knowledge that you get. So through my honours, I worked on zooplankton, which were the tiny little creatures you saw in the image before. And that got me started into microplastics because as I was sorting through my samples of my zooplankton, I thought I could see bits of plastic in some of their stomachs because the colour contrast is quite stark. And so I decided to pursue a PhD studying microplastics, and I'm really fortunate that I get to work on the RV Investigator, which is CSIRO's blue water research vessel operated by the Marine National Facility with my team that is pictured here, or half of my team that is pictured here, and we're trying to understand the abundance of plastics or microplastics in oceans around Australia, where in the water column they're found, but also trying to model the movement of those plastics and understand where they're going, where they're coming from, and the role they play in the base of the food web, so phytoplankton, zooplankton and bacteria. It's very excited to be here today.
Thanks, Elise. And I think that's highlighted the diversity. So we all have our interests in marine research, but we've got Anita, you have interests in art. I was interested in writing and STEM education and citizen science. So I think it shows that you can it's a broad church in what we can look at in science. So I'm just going to throw out some general questions. So what makes South Australia's marine life so unique? I know, Elise, you talked about it a bit.
Yeah,
before.
So we do have a really unique ecosystem in South Australia. It's called the Great Southern Reef. It's predominantly made of kelp forests, which are really incredible habitats, but they generally don't get the sort of popularity in media that the coral reefs get, just because it is quite a bit colder, so getting in there can be a little bit of a turn off at times as opposed to your tropical reefs that are always warm and you're always sunny. And identifying the animals in the kelp forest is really tricky as well because they're so good at camouflaging. Whereas in coral reefs, you're always spotting and seeing something new, so the more you spot and see, the more and more excited you get about it. But we have these really beautiful ecosystems, and they're really important because they're some of the largest breeding grounds for southern right whales. So up at the Bight is the world's biggest breeding ground for southern right whales. We have the largest breeding ground for the cuttlefish in Whyalla. And then we also have some of the largest colonies of sea lions. Along with that, a lot of the species that are present on our reefs are actually endemic to southern Australia. So 80 to 90% of the species that we find, you can only really find in this stretch of Australia, which is really incredible. The kelp forests are extremely important as well because they help regulate the carbon dioxide in the ecosystem too. So there's a lot of interesting things going on and the really big picture stuff too.
Yeah, we've got a lot to see, and as a cephalopod biologist, I can attest to the world-renowned cuttlefish aggregation. It is amazing, it is world famous, and May and June you can go up there and it's only, a couple of metres deep. You can snorkel, you don't need to dive. It is cold, but it is well worth it. So not, there's plenty of people that love the oceans and the beach, but not everyone's, interested in surfing or snorkeling. So, yeah, why we should all care about the marine environment?
Zoe, I think every single person should care about the ocean. The ocean covers about 70% of this planet, and it holds 97% of all life on Earth. And regardless of whether you live next to the ocean, we all depend on a healthy marine environment, and that might be just for recreational purposes like going fishing, enjoying a walk on the beach. But for others, it's that understanding that the ocean drives our weather and our climate. It also supports nutrient cycling. And it's these things that support the conditions to enable us to live on this planet. But the oceans do need to be managed and protected, and they're under threat. And a big part of looking after the plants and the animals in the ocean is that we need to keep marine ecosystems healthy and intact and resilient. And these marine ecosystems are under a lot of threat from pollution, from fishing, and also development. And some of the losses that we're seeing is just really concerning. Along the Metro coast, we've lost about 6,000 hectares of seagrass, and it's just not coming back. With the oyster reefs in just globally, we've lost 85%. It's the most critically threatened marine ecosystem on the planet. And then, as we know, we're also losing and have lost about 50% of coral reefs. But the good news is that through restoration we can bring back some of these ecosystems.
Which we'll hear about that later. So, like these, as Anita mentioned, these ecosystem services the marine environment provides help us all, whether we're interested in the ocean or not. Do you have anything else to add, Sophie?
I think from an economic standpoint as well, even if you're not a person who goes swimming or snorkeling or something like that, the economic aspect of it, especially in South Australia, is huge because we've got such a big seafood industry. It's a world-renowned seafood industry, and to keep that sustainable and keep it going and keep jobs in SA, we need to be really looking after our marine environment. And it's not necessarily just the seafood industry as well. We've got ecotourism as well, and we talked about the cuttlefish as well. That's something that people come from all around the world and the country to see. So looking after those things from an economic standpoint just makes sense.
Yeah, it's our fishing industry's big here in South Australia, and the boutique industries it supports, and we export worldwide, and it supports a lot of regional employment.
Yeah.
So I've got an interesting question now. So I don't know about you three, but when I'm a marine biologist, people think we spend our days swimming in lovely warm water, playing with dolphins, and I've never actually swum with a dolphin. My day-to-day life is very different. A lot of the time it's desk-based. I spend time working with fishers, going out with boats. I travel meeting all sorts of interesting people who are working on different things. I work on different instruments, high-tech instrumentation in different cities in Australia. And I think one of the most interesting things I've done lately was the Museum of Discovery, or MOD, here in Adelaide, which is a sort of futuristic-based museum. They're sort of gamifying one of our research projects, and they were sort of turning my colleague and I into an avatar. So we're part of the inside the game, as it were. So you never quite know where your day-to-day life will go. So my question to the three of you are, what are some of your highlights and interesting experiences working in marine science and conservation? Sophie, I'll start with you.
I think, what you're saying, there's such diversity in being a marine biologist or being in marine science, and I think that's probably one of the draw cards to the career, because you don't know what any day is going to look like. You could be in the lab dissecting fish, which isn't the most fun job because it smells a bit, but that's all right. You could be at your desk analysing data, could be out on boats. Like, there's just such variability. But I think I've probably got two big highlights in my career so far as a marine biologist. Number one was probably during my honours when I put together like my first kind of experiment, my first piece of research. And as I'm sure all of you know, when you plan research and plan these experiments, they don't always go as you plan them to. So with a bit of trial and error, getting to that first piece of data, those first results, and feeling like all of the knowledge I'd learnt throughout my undergrad and my honours was starting to come together and I was starting to make an impact. That was a really big moment for me. And then my next moment, I think, Elise, you'll be able to attest to this. I also had the opportunity to go on the RV Investigator, which is the Marine National Facility vessel that runs out of Hobart in Tasmania. I got the chance to go on a voyage across the Great Australian Bight from Hobart to Fremantle on a student training program, and that was honestly the best 12 days of my life. Like, the different research you can do offshore is just completely different to the kind of coastal stuff that we would do on a day-to-day basis, so that was amazing.
Yeah, I did a similar student training trip from Port Moresby to Darwin, and it was quite incredible.
Yeah.
But yeah, Elisa, you went on that as well?
Yeah, so Sophie and I actually went on the program different years, so we didn't meet on the boat, which is a bit funny. But CAPSTAN is the Collaborative Australian Postgraduate Sea Training Alliance Network, which is an incredible program that gets postgraduate and honours students onto vessels that work out in the deep blue waters. And you learn all of these skills that are so incredible, and I'm sure Sophie agrees, they sort of carry through for the rest of your degree. And it's just such an incredible opportunity to understand how science is done in a different environment, but also how multidisciplinary it can be and the multidisciplinary approach, but also the quantity and quality of research that can be done out there. So I'm really fortunate that a lot of my PhD has been based on voyages for the RV Investigator, which has been a big highlight for me. And I get to use labs out at sea, which are a pretty crazy experience because you've got your whole setup just on a boat, so you can collect your samples out in the middle of nowhere and analyse and process them right on the boat, which is just such an incredible experience.
Yeah, though I remember looking down a microscope at sea, and it wasn't too good for the stomach. I can tell you. It hurts. Anita, highlights and experiences of your work.
I think one of the highlights for me has been working with the flatback turtles. It was quite amazing to see my first little hatchling emerge from the sand. But I think I don't do a lot of research now, and so one of the things that I find so fascinating is all of the important work that researchers and scientists do is now being applied through the restoration work that I'm doing. And one of the things that I was never expecting was to combine my love of art with science as well. And just, you can see on the screen, this is just a project that I undertook recently. I was working with an artist so that we could visualise and convey to people, what do we expect to see these reefs, how do we expect them to form over from the moment we put the rocks and the oysters in the water over the next 7 years. And so it was really like visualising that, and it was quite an artistic process to communicate science.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anita. I'm just going to ask a few more questions drilling into individual panel members. So, Sophie, has there been a particular moment in your research on microplastics where you've gone, we've got a problem here? And I think this year it's been quite a pertinent topic with COVID-19 and all the necessary use of single-use plastic with takeaways and PPE, and it's needed, but it's kind of like, wow, we've really stepped up our single-use plastics. You know, it sort of stresses me out when I'm using all these takeaway containers and. So yeah, is it a problem? Should we be concerned?
Yeah, so I'll start with the first half of that question. So during my undergraduate degree, I got the opportunity to go to China for 2 weeks on a study program, which was amazing, really amazing experience. It was my first time overseas. And I remember going to the beaches in China and just seeing these huge amounts of waste and plastic littering the shorelines. And yeah, just thinking to myself, oh, you know, over here they have higher population, they don't have the same kind of waste management that we have in Australia, so this is a problem for these people, but it's not so much a problem for us. In Australia, we're doing pretty good. And then you fast forward to my honours, and it was my first few weeks doing my honours, and there was a couple of people who just started doing microplastic research, and there was this one project in particular, this girl's honours project, where she was sampling sediment throughout the Spencer Gulf region and analysing the microplastic content of sediment. And she had this sample from Moonta Bay, which is about 30 minutes from where I have spent the majority of my life growing up. And she was analysing it. It took her most of the day, and she came and knocked on our door in the office, and she said, guys, come and look at this. And we went and had a look, and she found 400 pieces of microplastic in I think it was roughly 60 ml sample of sediment, which that was the moment when I kind of realised this isn't a problem for overseas where they don't have the waste management systems and the plastics that we can physically see. It's the microplastics. Like I didn't realise we had an issue with microplastics here. And another interesting point about the pollution that she found is that it was actually fibres. It was microplastic fibres, and these fibres can come from like fishing gear, or a lot of them come from the clothes that we wear when we wash them. So when you're wearing like polyester and you're washing that in the washing machine, these little fibres come off of it, and we don't see them, but they end up going through wastewater into the marine environment. And yeah, that was really the point where I thought to myself, wow, okay, we do actually have a problem here in Australia. We just can't see it like they do overseas. And
I think the unseen threats are harder because it doesn't sort of react with us emotionally. We can't, like the big plastics, we see animals getting strangled and those sorts of things, and it's very visceral, but these things unseen. But you've seen it yourself as a scientist now.
That's the thing, actually seeing it down the microscope, that was the point when it triggered for me, because I did actually see it. But for people not seeing it, they probably don't realise. And with the increased single-use plastic during COVID, I mean, obviously this is something that we have to do. We're going through a global pandemic. We can't really avoid it. But I think there's certain single-use things that we can make better choices for. I mean, the disposable masks and things they have to use for in the medical profession, that's completely understandable use of single use. I mean, we're trying to get through a pandemic, but someone in their day-to-day life who might want to wear a mask, there's like reusable masks. Or if you're going to the coffee shop and they're not taking keep cups, sit down at the coffee shop. Like there's just, I think this is a time where we are increasing our single-use plastic use at the moment, but we can reevaluate some of the stuff we're already using and make some better choices, because unfortunately this increase in single-use plastics is going to have an effect on the marine environment, but we want to limit that as much as possible. Yeah, okay, great. Thanks, Sophie. So we hear a lot about the problems and the threats to the marine environment, and it can get really depressing and a bit overwhelming, like should we lose hope? And you know, a lot of the problems, they're not easy. There's no easy solutions. They're tough challenges. But I think Anita's got a great story where you're using new technology to restore lost reefs, a lost habitat. So can you tell us about this? It sounds really exciting.
Well, restoring reefs has actually been occurring for about 15 years. Mainly in the United States, but we have taken every single project and learnt something new. And every time we go to a new location, we learn something new about how to build that reef, but also what we expect to grow and colonise on that reef. And it's very unique to each location. So the Nature Conservancy has been restoring reefs all across the southern part of Australia for the last 5 years. And the reason that we're doing this is to bring back a critically threatened ecosystem back from the brink of extinction. So the way that we do that is we place limestone reef boulders onto the sea floor to create a reef base. And then we get hatchery-raised native oysters, and they settle onto recycled oyster shell. And then we place that amongst the reef rows. And this picture that you can see here is one of the largest restoration projects to date in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's just off the coast of Ardrossan. It's in it's about 1 kilometre offshore in about 8 metres of water depth. And each single little thing that you can see there is an individual reef. So in total, we have about 160 reefs. They're about half a metre off the floor and anywhere between 10 to 35 metres in length. We built those reefs using about 10,000 tonnes of limestone. And we have seeded that reef with 8 million. So this is a little video just in the background of one of our divers who placed some of those oysters out onto the reef just in November last year. So what we expect to see with these, with that particular reef, and all of our reefs, is that it will take roughly between 7 and 10 years for those reefs to really get established and for species to start colonising that reef. As they grow, they'll start to create this really intricate matrix of oysters, and with that, we'll start to see a lot of other species colonising that reef as well.
Yeah, we're pretty lucky to have this in South Australia. There's not many examples, or probably in Australia, where a near extinct marine habitat's being restored. And if it gets going in Glenelg, people might be able to go and snorkel on it or
that's
something
right.
like that.
Yeah, so that's a good. There's another reef that's going to be built later this year, just off the coast of Glenelg.
Yeah, it's exciting. So, Elise, with your research on microplastics and the distribution of microplastics, again, looking more at solutions in terms of what can citizens, everyday people do to help reduce, our plastic footprint?
Yeah, so the most important thing I think with trying to reduce your plastic footprint is trying to aim for progress, not perfection. So don't get caught up on doing it perfectly, because that's when you're going to start putting too much pressure on yourself, and that's when you're going to start slipping up and decide that it's all too hard, whereas making small changes is going to be really beneficial. I think seeing and understanding the problem is also a really big thing. So I had a similar story as Sophie, where I had a bunch of third-year students and we were looking at sand in a local beach that we thought was going to be quite clean, and we saw all of these fibres. Now, it's pretty hard to see them, but when you start looking for them on the beaches, you can actually start spotting microplastics. So next time you're out in that environment, try to look for them, and maybe it'll prompt you to feel like you want to do something more. I think it's really important as well to remember that producers are the ones that create a lot of plastic, and there's often a lot of weight on the consumer's shoulders to do the right thing, and we should be definitely trying. And a few of the easiest sort of things we can do are use reusable water bottles or take our cups out with us. But of course, during COVID, it's a little bit harder to take them, as not all places are accepting them, which is completely understandable. But if you don't want to sit down and have a coffee, you can ask to go topless, which is one less piece of plastic that you're putting back into the environment. It's really important as well to sort of understand your recycling process too. So just because a piece of plastic has the recycling symbol on there doesn't mean that it can actually be recycled. And the restrictions are getting a lot harder. There was this case in Queensland after China decided that the standards of our rubbish going to China had to be better than they are. A small town in Queensland just stopped recycling altogether, and all of the recycling that we as individuals were doing was just getting taken straight to the waste. So it's better to try to avoid even putting anything in there, because you don't know that it's going to go to the right place, even if you're trying really hard to. I think it's really important just to start somewhere, pick something that you can do. It doesn't need to be drastic. Some people will go very intense plastic free, but if you can just make a small start, it's going to be better than nothing. Even if it is just a coffee cup and you have one coffee out of your keep cup instead of a takeaway cup, if that's one coffee a week, you're saving 52 pieces of rubbish from going into landfill. That's never going to be reused or purposed again, because even some of the bio cups that we use can't actually be recycled because they might have a plastic lining on the inside, and some of the bioplastics that have been created need really specific factories to process them, and they're not actually as common as we think, so often they end up in the landfill as well.
So any more tips on what people can do? think of any?
I think as well as kind of looking at your own plastic use, there's a lot of opportunities to go to like beach cleanups and that kind of thing. So organisations like Sea Shepherd or even local council groups will organise beach cleanups. And there's also an initiative called Take 3 for the Sea, and it's literally what it sounds like. Anytime you go to the beach, pick up 3 pieces of plastic, and even that little contribution is going to be making a difference. So little things like that.
Especially because those larger plastics are sometimes what turn into the microplastics. So just stopping the large plastics from breaking down into smaller, well, not breaking down, they break up because they never leave the environment into smaller and smaller pieces. You've just removed that from the environment. So you're decreasing the problem as it is.
Yeah, like kind of stopping it at the source,
I
guess.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I can mention something about seafood. So Australians love seafood. We eat more than the global average, but 70% of the seafood we eat is actually imported from overseas. Some of that imported seafood is sustainable, some of it's not. So I think being selective about your seafood choices, we do have some great local industries here, and you can, for the Australian fisheries, you can go online. There's a government website where you can check all the status of the fisheries from where your seafood comes from. So being aware about where your seafood's coming from can help as well. So just a final question to the three of you. If there's people in the audience out there thinking or perhaps contemplating having a career in marine biology or conservation or STEM for that matter, what are your tips?
I think for me, I know when I was at school trying to figure out what I wanted to do, I didn't really know what direction to go. So I think for school kids who might be listening out there, just continuing with their science education, so whether that's studying science in your later years of school or doing some kind of science or STEM degree after university, even if you don't necessarily go into a marine biology kind of career, the skills that you learn from studying STEM can be carried on to a huge range of different careers. And I think we need to think about science these days as being a human endeavour. It's not necessarily just the scientists who are doing the science. They rely on so many other careers and industries to help them do that science. So even if you don't go into marine biology, you can definitely go into some of those other industries that help us do what we do. So
yeah, definitely. And going on from what Sophie was saying, there are so many great citizen science initiatives. So if you don't necessarily want to do a science degree because science isn't for everyone, there are ways that you can get involved that help the researchers. So there's beautiful citizen science projects. There's even a few for microplastics where you can count the microplastics and then let the scientists know, and we can add it to a larger sort of database. But I think it's also really important, you don't need to necessarily be a marine biologist to sort of help protect the ocean. If your skill sets don't fit science, you can choose your skill sets and make them fit into a world of marine biology. So say your skills are in marketing, you can choose to work for a company that promotes sustainable practices or anything to do with protecting the environment. Even if you work in hospitality as well, there are things that you can do and initiate that will help, because every little bit counts. So
yeah, great. Anita?
Yeah, I would suggest getting involved in some existing citizen science as well as volunteering programs. There's some really good volunteer programs that are run through the new Greening Adelaide. I'm trying to remember the NRM groups have changed, but it's called the Coastal Youth Ambassadors program, and it's aimed at young teens. And so they typically will run that program at the start of the year. And that's just a way to meet other like-minded people and to learn about real-life conservation issues that are affecting our coast. And another really great program that you can do off some of our shores is to get involved in Reef Watch, which is monitoring the intertidal zone, and you get to learn a lot about the species, but you're also contributing to real life science and conservation.
Yeah, and you can get in contact with individual researchers as well and reach out to them, and a lot of researchers are very happy to take on volunteers. And I think across the board, I'd say try lots of different things, because then you can find out what you like and what you don't like, and then connecting and meeting and networking with lots of people is a great way to go. So that wraps up the formal session of tonight's event. So we're going to hand it over to you now, the audience. So what questions do you have about South Australia's marine life, as problems, as solutions, or careers in STEM? Yeah, fire away.
We've got a question that asks about, does climate change have an effect on how microplastics travel through the ocean, and even how they are broken down to enter fish populations?
Wow, good question. Maybe Elise or both of you?
Well, I can start.
Yeah.
So it's such a new area of research that we're finding out more and more. So for a long time, people thought majority of the plastics or the microplastics were actually at the surface of the ocean, and now people are they thought it was at the surface of the ocean because the polymers of the plastic have a lower density than that of seawater, so you expect them to sit on the surface. But they're finding that as the plastics age, they actually sink further down. So even something like that is still quite new, and we're still understanding so much. But you would imagine plastics break down a lot faster when they are in hotter temperatures. That's how larger pieces of plastic become more brittle and they start fragmenting. So I would imagine that as the heating increases, that breaking up process of the plastics would increase. As for the movement, that's probably a bit too hard for me to answer right now, as we just don't know. We still don't fully understand how quickly the plastics move in the currents, which is hopefully something that I'm trying to address with my research.
But currents are changing with climate change, so that things are going to move in a different way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think, with changing currents, some of you out there might have heard of these accumulations of plastic in the ocean, like in these gyres in the ocean. So when those currents are changing, that's going to change where those accumulations are.
Plastic vortex, is that what that is?
Yeah, exactly. And with the chemical pollution that they mentioned, things like ocean acidification and ocean warming are definitely going to have an effect on how chemical pollutants interact with things like plastics. So there's definitely going to be an effect. What the effect is, we just don't know yet. There's so much more research that needs to happen.
And they're still sort of understanding, because temperature and the density of seawater plays an effect on where the plastics sit in the water column, and of course those are changing with climate change as well. So it is very likely that the way climate change impacts the oceans will impact microplastics and microplastic distributions. Just how, we don't really know.
Yeah.
Cool. So we've got another question, and it's actually about being a woman in science. And is it difficult being a woman in marine biology?
I can start. That's a really good question, and being as honest as possible, I think we've come a long way, but we've still got a long way to go. I remember when I was a student, more of my class was women than men, but all my lecturers were men. And generally today that's still the same, that in senior positions, not so much at the postgraduate level or the next level up, it's we've got pretty much equal men and women, but when we get to the senior levels, it's still very much dominated by men. And I think that can, the lack of visible role models can be an issue sometimes. And then you've got all those aspects of unconscious bias and that sort of, which is documented, it's quantified, it does exist. But I think there's great momentum for change and things are changing. So I think it's a great profession for women, and not just marine biology. And I think it's something that's really noted now. So I think we've got a long way to go with the trends and getting that parity, and with other underrepresented groups. But we've got momentum now, which I think is really important.
I'm just adding on to that, Zoe. I think in science, and particularly the work I'm currently doing, it's really construction based. So it's a male dominated industry in construction. It can be quite male dominated in science. also in the aquaculture industry. So I'm constantly surrounded by males, and that actually affects the way in which I may carry myself and behave. And in terms of like leadership, I start to notice that, even though there's a lot of really strong women who are leading this project within the South Australian government as well as the conservation sector, you do hit this sort of like glass ceiling where there are men who are, at the top, and it is challenging, like what you're saying about the mentors and the role models, because sometimes if you want to progress into some of those more senior positions, that bias of a male is, they're looking for certain characteristics and qualities that are very different to how a woman may decide
You're more likely to hire someone in your image.
Exactly.
And, they've done statistics
That's
on
right.
that. So.
So that can be, a little bit of a challenge, but I think we really need to be moving away. And I think I'm seeing this with, it's not about equality, it's about equity, and really figuring out, what are those aspects that are more suited to the way a woman would lead, or the decisions or the challenges that she may face.
Yeah, so I wouldn't, don't let it put you off. I mean, when I was at a fisheries institute when I was a student, and fisheries science was probably one of very male dominant. There was no women. Women did conservation and men did fisheries science generally. And, but I never really was drawn to it because I didn't see myself in that place. But then I loved reading stock assessment reports when they came out, and it's like, maybe I do like it. And so, don't let it put you off. And I think it is changing a lot, and that's what we need. We need bright new generation that is out there changing the world, doing things differently, and
And I'm actually starting to see that my uniqueness is my strength.
Yeah. You see things differently, you're doing things differently.
Yeah.
And
it's starting to be valued, I think, more in the workplace.
Yeah, you come across a different perspective on things, definitely.
Yeah, and as a student as well, I think it has been identified, and I know a lot of the sort of male role models that I've had, or the males in leadership roles that I've worked with, especially working with the Marine National Facility, they've all been so supportive of me coming up, and they've all supported me in making my own leadership decisions when I've had to, but making a space that's comfortable for me to step into that role as well. And I found that's been really fantastic to see.
Yeah. Darren.
So I've got a question that's actually quite specific but can be broadened out. So someone has asked, do Flinders Port sponsor the shellfish reef restorations? But you could probably comment more broadly about what social good responsibilities do companies and private organisations have? Yeah,
was that Flinders Ports? Yeah. They don't actually sponsor this program, but it's a really good question. The funding for these projects have come from the South Australian government and as well as the Commonwealth and local government. So it's a really unique, I think, space where you're seeing all three levels of government agree on something and all are contributing. But a large portion of the funding has also come from private philanthropy, and there has been some corporate investment as well. So our on the York Peninsula Reef, NAB put in $250,000 into that project. So there's lots of opportunities, and the funding comes from all varieties and places.
So there's a question that's going back to about careers and future jobs, basically. Are there jobs for graduates of marine biology if students choose not to do honours?
If they don't choose to do honours? It depends where the student wants to go, I think. There's such a diverse array of career options that you could choose. I think honours helps in many situations. and a lot of people do honours. So with any job, it's a competitive market. So if you have honours, it can really help. But yeah, it does depend what sort of area. If it's industry, if it's tourism, you might have amazing dive or field experiences. Like where I used to work, it was all about the field officers. It was all about, how they can drive a boat and how many sea hours they had in really rough, exposed waters. So it does depend where you want to go. But yeah, honours definitely, from my experience, can help a lot with employment opportunities.
Especially research, if you want to go down a research path, getting that research experience in an honours year, because I feel like honours and PhD as well, they're kind of like skill building experiences that kind of build up those skills you need for future opportunities. So if it's research that you're thinking about, then I would seriously consider honours. But if you're considering something more like tourism or something along those lines, then honours probably isn't needed. But
essential for research, but research is
it's just one aspect.
It's one avenue.
I think if people tell you that if you do marine biology you're not going to get a job, it's not true. I got told that when I did marine biology, and it almost made me want to try even harder. And I think that you can create a job from anything that you're passionate about. And I think the reason why people do continue to do additional studies is because you have a real fascination to look deeper into something particular in a certain field. So with me, it was animal behaviour and evolution. But, that's really be driven not to do things just because you're going to get a career, but do it because you love it. And a lot of the people who didn't do honours, they've been involved in the tourism industry, working at marine aquariums, aquaculture, diving. There's plenty of options.
And that sort of myth that, if you're a marine biologist, there's no jobs, it might come from the fact that everyone thinks we work at SeaWorld or something. And they think, there's only one SeaWorld in Australia, so that one job that's available that my kid's going to get's, rare. So I think it can stem from a bit of that preconception about what our jobs actually are.
I never would have expected to be in construction. So that just tells you about the variety of these jobs.
Yeah. So we've got one final question for tonight. Is there a way for microplastics already in the ocean to be removed?
Wow. Big challenge.
Big question, big challenge. So obviously we're kind of just figuring out now how bad the problem with plastics and microplastic pollution is. So a lot of the research is very new. It hasn't really been tested all that much. There is an enzyme that's been developed, I think in Japan. It's called PETase. Basically what that does is it breaks down the polymer bonds of PET, but there hasn't been a huge amount of testing done on that yet. What happens to the monomer form of PET once it's broken down, how that might interact with other marine organisms. So there's definitely a lot of research happening at the moment about what to do with all this plastic we've got in the ocean, but there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. So.
And with that innovation as well, PET is only one type of plastic, and there's quite a few more. So you also have to deal with the balance where we've gotten rid of this one type, but what portion of the plastic problem does that one type represent, and what do we do once we've released this enzyme into the ocean? What other issues are going to arise? And there's so many problems with trying to pull the plastic out of the ocean. So the microplastics, with your sampling, if you're trying to pull microplastics out of the ocean, you're also pulling up quite a large abundance of phytoplankton and zooplankton, which form the base of the food web. So you're basically removing the food for the larval stages of your fish, which is really quite critical, and you want to be cautious about what you're doing and how you're going to remove it. Yeah. So I think the biggest sort of thing is the plastic's already in the ocean. It's more stopping how much more we're putting into it, because there's still so much plastic going in. So it's stopping it from the get-go and then figuring out how we can remove it once we stop adding to it.
Yeah, there's been a lot of different filters and that kind of thing trialled, but they bring up the issues of getting those plankton out of the ocean, which we don't want. But I know if any of you have been to Melbourne in the Yarra River, they have those garbage traps on the side of the Yarra, and they aren't necessarily taking plastics out of the ocean, but they're stopping them once they're in that river system from reaching the marine environment. So something like that is working really well in Melbourne, for example. So kind of going off of things like that and innovating how it could be used in a marine setting, I think that's kind of the challenge for researchers at the moment.
Probably need them for the torrens.
Yeah, probably.
Well, great. I think that wraps up tonight's session, our Deep Blue Future, brought to you by National Science Week South Australia. I'll thank the audience for some great questions tonight, and I'd like to thank our panel, Anita, Sophie and Elise. So thank you and good night.